A ruthless businessman punishes his maid in front of his daughter, believing discipline is all that matters. But what happens next will shake his world, as his daughter takes a stand he never saw coming. Subscribe to our channel to see how this story unfolds, and don't forget to leave a comment. Where are you watching from? The sun had not yet risen over the sprawling estate of the Pager's mansion. In the pale light of dawn, shadows cast long stretches across the marble floors, and the stillness that filled the room suggested that everything was in perfect order. To the casual observer, it was a symbol of success, a world of opulence governed by rules, schedules, and control. But beneath the surface, tension simmered in the silence, kept barely in check by the demanding presence of the estate's master, Frank Pager. Frank had built his fortune through sheer willpower, creating a chain of luxury hotels that were known for their strict adherence to perfection. In his world, there was no room for errors, and certainly none for excuses. His philosophy was simple. Discipline was the key to success, and every person under his employ had to reflect that principle. To Frank, rules were non-negotiable, and those who worked for him had to abide by them without question. For more than 10 years, Rebecca, a 55-year-old housekeeper, had been a silent fixture in the Pager household. She moved through the mansion's grand halls like a ghost, cleaning floors polished to a mirror sheen, dusting chandeliers that hung like frozen cascades of light. She was the kind of employee who worked without complaint, and Frank believed she appreciated the opportunity to work under his roof. What he never saw, however, were the years of silent struggles that weighed on her heart. Rebecca had long learned to suppress her frustrations and bury her emotions. She was a widow, raising her only daughter, Maria, who had been diagnosed with a chronic illness that required constant care. The bills were endless: doctor visits, treatments, medications, and no amount of careful budgeting could ever seem to cover everything. Rebecca juggled several jobs to make ends meet, and working for the Pagers provided the stability she desperately needed, even though it often demanded more of her than she could comfortably give. That morning, everything seemed to spiral out of control. Rebecca had spent the entire night at the hospital. Maria's condition had suddenly worsened, and Rebecca had rushed her daughter to the emergency room. Hours dragged on in the waiting room, with every minute stretching into an eternity. She sat hunched in a plastic chair, exhausted but unable to rest, watching doctors move briskly through the halls. Her hands clenched her purse in her lap, the anxiety gnawing away at her as she waited for news. When the doctor finally emerged, his face was drawn and serious. Maria would need to stay overnight for observation. Rebecca nodded, her heart heavy, knowing she had no choice but to leave her daughter in the hands of the nurses. She whispered a prayer over Maria's sleeping form before dragging herself home, just long enough to change her clothes and prepare for the next grueling day. There was no time to sleep, no time to recover. She glanced at the clock as she left her small, modest apartment. She was running late, something that almost never happened. Panic clawed at her chest. Being late for work at the Pagers' estate was not an option. Frank Pager's tolerance for tardiness was non-existent, and Rebecca knew the consequences would be severe. Rebecca hurried through the streets, clutching her coat tightly against the chilly morning air. The bus was delayed, and she could feel the minutes slipping away, each one a thread unraveling the fragile balance she had worked so hard to maintain. As she finally boarded, she kept her head down, wringing her hands in her lap as the bus crept through the city streets. Every stop felt like a small eternity. The estate loomed in the distance as she hurried along the familiar path. The iron gates that stood before the mansion looked more imposing than ever, as though they sensed her anxiety and mirrored it back at her. She fumbled with her keycard at the gate, the cold metal slipping through her trembling fingers. The gate swung open, and Rebecca rushed inside, her heart pounding in her chest. The grand foyer was silent when she entered, her shoes clicking softly against the marble floor. She took a moment to steady her breath, trying to calm the storm brewing inside her. Perhaps, if she moved quickly enough, she could finish her tasks before anyone noticed she was late. If she could just stay invisible a little longer. Rebecca grabbed a dustcloth and hurried into the sitting room where an ornate vase sat on a pedestal by the window. It was one of Frank Pager's prized possessions, an antique imported from Italy, with delicate blue and gold patterns that seemed to shimmer in the morning light. Rebecca had dusted it 100 times before without incident, but today her exhaustion made her clumsy. As she reached for the vase, her hand slipped. The vase teetered for a moment, and in her panic she tried to catch it, only to knock it off balance completely. It shattered against the floor in a deafening crash, the sound echoing through the silent halls like a gunshot. Rebecca froze, her heart plummeting. Her hands trembled as she knelt to gather the shards, her mind racing. The cost of the vase was more than she could make in several months of work. She knew Frank Pager would be furious. The clock on the wall ticked louder with every second that passed. Rebecca worked quickly, hoping against hope that she could clean up the mess before anyone noticed. But as she gathered the last of the shards into a dustpan, she heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps approaching. Her heart sank. It was Frank Pager. She stood up, clutching the dustpan tightly as he entered the room. His presence filled the space, sharp and commanding, dressed in a tailored suit that seemed as rigid as the man himself. "You're late," he said, his voice low and cold. I'm sorry, sir," Rebecca stammered, lowering her eyes. "There was an emergency with my daughter. I tried to—" "I don't care about your excuses," Frank interrupted, his tone sharper now. "Do you know how much that vase cost?" Rebecca swallowed hard, her throat dry. She knew the number all too well, but the words refused to leave her mouth. Frank stepped closer, his gaze cold and unforgiving. His eyes swept over the shattered pieces on the floor, and his jaw tightened. To him, the broken vase was more than just a material loss. It was a violation of the order he had built, a reminder that no matter how many rules he imposed, mistakes could still happen. And in his mind, mistakes were unacceptable. "You've been with us for 10 years, Rebecca," Frank said, his voice like a blade. "You should know better by now." Rebecca's hands trembled as she stood there, silent, knowing that no explanation would satisfy him. "You're paid to do your job, and if you can't do it properly—" He trailed off, his expression darkening. Rebecca stood in silence, the weight of his expectations pressing down on her like a physical force. She knew she was on the verge of losing everything: the job that kept her afloat, the means to care for her daughter, the fragile stability she had fought so hard to maintain. And yet, there was nothing she could say that would make things right. Not in Frank Pager's world. As the tension between them thickened, Rebecca could only hope that the day would end without further incident. But deep down, she knew this was only the beginning. The heavy silence in the room felt suffocating. The shards of the shattered vase lay in jagged pieces across the floor like fragments of a broken promise. Rebecca stood frozen, clutching the dustpan as if it were a lifeline, but nothing could shield her from the fury radiating from Frank Pager. His sharp eyes scanned the scene, narrowing as he took in the damage. Frank moved closer, his shoes clicking against the marble floor with deliberate precision. The coldness in his gaze could have frozen stone. His perfectly tailored suit reflected his rigid personality, structured, exacting, and without tolerance for imperfection. To Frank, this vase was not just an expensive piece of decor. It was a symbol of the order and control he demanded from everything and everyone around him. And now it lay in ruins. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" Frank hissed, his voice low and controlled, a tone that carried far more weight than any shout. Rebecca felt her throat constrict, words tangled in her mind, but none came out. She knew it wouldn't matter. In the decade she had worked for him, Frank had never cared about explanations, only results. And today she had failed to meet his impossible standard. I'm so sorry, Mr. Pager," Rebecca finally whispered. "I didn't mean—" "I'm not interested in your apologies," Frank interrupted sharply. "Apologies don't clean up broken vases, Rebecca." He glanced at the shards scattered across the floor with disdain, as if they represented not only her failure, but also a direct affront to his authority. For Frank, this wasn't just a mistake. It was an attack on the pristine order of his world. And in his world, there were consequences for mistakes. Rebecca bent down again to gather the last few shards, her hands trembling. The silence between them stretched taut, and each second seemed to add weight to her burden. She could feel Frank's gaze burning into her, as if he expected her to fix what was now irreparable. "You've been with us for over 10 years, Frank said coldly, his words slicing the air. "One would think you'd have learned by now how to avoid clumsiness." Rebecca's hands faltered as she placed the shards into the dustpan. Her chest ached with the weight of exhaustion, physical, emotional, and mental. The long hours she worked, the constant stress of caring for her daughter, and now this moment. Every part of her life felt like it was crumbling, just like the vase at her feet. Her voice came out in a low murmur, almost inaudible. "It was an accident, sir." "An accident?" Frank's voice dropped to a dangerously quiet tone. "You call this an accident? Do you think accidents pay the bills? Do you think accidents keep this house running?" Rebecca pressed her lips together to stop them from quivering. 1,000 explanations hovered on the edge of her mind: how she had spent the entire night in the hospital with Maria, how her daughter's condition had worsened, how exhausted she was, but she knew none of it would matter. Not to Frank. He didn't see people's struggles, he only saw outcomes. Frank's jaw clenched as if the very act of standing there, watching her scramble to clean up the mess, was an insult to his authority. And then, in a sudden burst of rage, he did the unthinkable. His hand reached out, grabbing the decorative wooden switch from a nearby stand, a piece that was meant to be purely ornamental. Before Rebecca could react, he slashed the switch across her back with a swift, brutal motion. The sharp sting of the blow stole her breath. She gasped, more from the shock than the pain, and stumbled forward. Her knees hit the marble floor with a painful thud, and the dustpan slipped from her grasp, scattering the shards once more. Rebecca's hands pressed against the cold floor as she struggled to steady herself, every muscle trembling under the weight of humiliation. Frank's face showed no sign of regret, only cold satisfaction, as if this act of punishment was not only justified but necessary. To him, it was just another lesson in discipline. "You'll think twice before making such mistakes again," he said flatly. Rebecca's chest rose and fell rapidly as she fought to contain her emotions. She wanted to cry, to scream, to beg for mercy, but she knew none of it would make a difference. All she could do was endure as she always had. With great effort, she pushed herself back up, her movements slow and deliberate, refusing to let Frank see how deeply he had wounded her. Her silence was not one of acceptance, but survival. She had learned long ago that in a world ruled by people like Frank Pager, there was no room for weakness. Rebecca bent down once more to gather the scattered shards, each motion deliberate and careful, though her body ached from the blow. Frank watched her for a moment longer, then turned sharply on his heel and left the room without another word. His footsteps echoed down the corridor, fading into the distance. Rebecca remained on her knees, her hands trembling as she collected the broken pieces. The weight of exhaustion pressed down on her, but she kept moving, refusing to let the pain stop her. There were still tasks to be done, and she couldn't afford to fail again. Not if she wanted to keep this job. Not if she wanted to keep her daughter's treatment going. As she picked up the final shard, she felt a presence nearby. She looked up slowly and saw her reflection in the polished surface of the grand staircase. And behind the staircase, hidden just out of view, stood a familiar figure. It was Amelie. Her father's harsh words and actions had not gone unnoticed. The young girl's wide eyes were filled with disbelief and sadness. She had witnessed everything, every cold word, every harsh blow. And for the first time she saw her father not as the successful businessman she had admired, but as someone who was capable of cruelty. Rebecca lowered her gaze, shame and sorrow pooling in her chest. She knew Amelie was only a child, but something in the girl's expression suggested that she understood more than most adults. The silence between them was heavy with unspoken truths. Amelie stepped back slowly, disappearing from view as quietly as she had arrived. Rebecca exhaled a shuddering breath and forced herself to stand. Her back throbbed with pain, but she ignored it. She had to finish her work. There was no time to dwell on the events of the morning, not when her survival depended on this job. She resumed her tasks, her movements slower but no less precise. The day was far from over, and Rebecca knew that in this house, perfection was expected at all times, no matter the cost. But deep down, she also knew that something had shifted. Amelie had seen what happened, and that small fact carried with it a glimmer of change, a possibility that perhaps, just perhaps, the cracks in Frank's perfect world were beginning to show. The air in the room felt heavier now, as if the broken vase had not only shattered on the floor, but also fractured the rigid order Frank had worked so hard to maintain. And though the shards had been gathered and the mess cleaned, the damage lingered, waiting to surface once more. The Pager mansion stood in its usual grandeur, but something in the air felt different as Amelie stepped through the front doors, her travel bag slung over her shoulder. The familiar scent of polished wood and floral arrangements greeted her, yet the atmosphere seemed heavy, as though the weight of unspoken tension hung in the walls. Amelie had been away at college for several months, and her father's rare, curt messages barely kept her connected to life back home. But now that she was back, she immediately noticed the subtle changes. The staff members moved more cautiously than usual, their gazes downcast, as if they were avoiding an invisible threat. Amelie sensed a palpable tension in the air, one that hinted at something she could not yet name. She greeted a passing housemaid with a warm smile, but the maid only nodded quickly before hurrying away. The rushed interaction left Amelie uneasy. She had always considered their home to be one of order, not fear. Something had happened in her absence, and she was determined to find out what. As Amelie made her way through the marble-floored halls, the silence that followed her felt eerie. Usually, Rebecca, their longtime housekeeper, would greet her cheerfully, always ready with a kind word or gentle encouragement. But today, Rebecca was nowhere to be seen. Amelie's heart sank. It wasn't like Rebecca to hide away, not after all the years of loyal service she had given the family. When she finally entered the sitting room, the sight before her stopped her in her tracks. Rebecca was kneeling on the floor, carefully scrubbing the tiles. Her movements were slow, and there was something off about the way she held herself, as if she was carrying an invisible weight on her back. "Rebecca," Amelie called softly, stepping further into the room. The older woman stiffened but didn't look up. "Good afternoon, Miss Amelie," she whispered without turning her head. Amelie frowned. Rebecca's voice sounded hollow, almost as though she was trying to keep her emotions locked away beneath a thin veneer of politeness. It was so unlike the woman Amelie remembered, strong and kind, even in the face of exhaustion. Before Amelie could ask what was wrong, she heard footsteps behind her. She turned just as her father entered the room, his presence as commanding as ever. He didn't notice Amelie at first. His cold, focused gaze was locked on Rebecca. "Did you finish with the floors yet?" Frank Pager asked sharply, as if Rebecca were nothing more than an inconvenience in his tightly controlled world. "Almost, sir," Rebecca replied, her voice barely above a whisper. Amelie watched as her father's expression darkened. He stepped closer, looming over Rebecca like a shadow, and though he didn't raise his voice, the tension in his words was unmistakable. "Almost isn't good enough. I expect things to be done correctly and on time. You know that." Rebecca kept her head down, nodding weakly. Amelie felt a knot tighten in her chest. The way her father spoke, the way Rebecca shrank beneath his gaze, it was all wrong. "Father," Amelie said cautiously, her voice cutting through the thick tension in the room. Frank turned toward her, his expression softening slightly, though the sharpness didn't fully leave his eyes. "Amelie, I didn't expect you so soon." Amelie smiled weakly, though her mind was racing. "I wanted to surprise you, but—" Her eyes flicked to Rebecca, who was still on her knees, wiping the floor as though her life depended on it. "Is everything all right?" Frank followed her gaze, but his expression remained unreadable. "Just dealing with some poor performance," he said dismissively, as if the matter were trivial. Amelie's heart sank further. Something had shifted in her father since the last time she saw him, and it wasn't for the better. She had always known him to be strict, but this felt different, colder, harsher. And Rebecca, who had been a constant source of warmth in her life, seemed utterly defeated. That evening, Amelie lay on her bed, staring at the ceiling as her thoughts swirled. Her father had always been a man of rules, but the man she had seen today was someone else entirely. He hadn't just been strict, he had been cruel. The look in Rebecca's eyes, the way she had cowered under his gaze, haunted Amelie. She couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible had happened while she was away. Memories from her childhood flooded her mind. Times when her father had taught her the importance of discipline and responsibility, of always striving for excellence. Back then, she had admired him, believing that his strictness came from a place of love, that it was meant to prepare her for the harsh realities of life. But now, those lessons felt hollow. What she had witnessed today wasn't discipline. It was control. And it didn't feel right. Amelie sat up, her heart pounding in her chest. She couldn't ignore what she had seen. Rebecca had been with their family for years, always working quietly in the background, always kind. Even when no one was watching, Amelie knew that the way her father treated Rebecca wasn't fair. And it certainly wasn't right. But what could she do? Her father was a powerful man, not just in their household but in the business world as well. He wasn't the kind of person who welcomed criticism, especially from his own daughter. The thought of confronting him felt daunting, almost impossible. Yet, the image of Rebecca kneeling on the floor, her body bent under the weight of humiliation, wouldn't leave her mind. Amelie clenched her fists. She had to do something. She couldn't just stand by and let this continue. But how could she make her father see what he had become? How could she make him understand that kindness and fairness were not signs of weakness, but of strength? The answers didn't come easily, but one thing was clear: she couldn't stay silent. Not this time. The next morning, Amelie rose early, her resolve hardened. She needed to speak to Rebecca, to understand what had truly happened. She found the housekeeper in the kitchen, quietly preparing breakfast. There were dark circles under Rebecca's eyes, and her shoulders sagged as if the weight of the world rested on them. "Rebecca," Amelie said gently, sitting down at the kitchen table. "Can we talk?" Rebecca hesitated for a moment, glancing toward the door as if afraid someone might overhear. Then, with a heavy sigh, she nodded and sat down across from Amelie. "I know my father can be difficult," Amelie began, choosing her words carefully. "But something feels different. What happened while I was away?" Rebecca's eyes flickered with a mix of exhaustion and sadness. "It's nothing, Miss Amelie, just the usual." Amelie shook her head. "No, it's not. Please, Rebecca, I need to know." For a moment, Rebecca seemed to consider keeping the truth hidden, but then, as if the weight of it all became too much to bear, she let out a long, weary sigh. "There was an accident," she admitted quietly. "I broke a vase. Your father wasn't pleased." Amelie's heart clenched. She knew her father well enough to understand what that meant. "What did he do?" she asked, though she feared the answer. Rebecca hesitated, her hands folding and unfolding in her lap. "He hit me," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Amelie's breath caught in her throat. A wave of anger and disbelief washed over her. She couldn't believe what she was hearing. Her father, her strict but composed father, had struck Rebecca. "I'm so sorry," Amelie whispered, her voice thick with emotion. Rebecca offered a small, tired smile. "It's not your fault, child." But Amelie knew better. Something had to change. And if her father couldn't see the damage he was causing, then she would have to show him. The day passed in a blur for Amelie. Each minute felt heavier than the last, weighed down by the knowledge of what Rebecca had shared with her. Every glance at her father during the evening only intensified her sense of dread. Frank Pager, dressed in his immaculate suit, sat at the head of the long dining table, as poised and confident as ever, his silverware clinking quietly against the fine china. The large chandelier above them illuminated the room in a soft golden glow, but for Amelie, the warmth of the light couldn't chase away the cold truth that lingered between them. Dinner had never felt so long. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the occasional question from Frank about Amelie's studies, questions she answered with as few words as possible. She watched him closely, trying to understand how the man she had respected all her life could also be capable of such cruelty. The image of him standing over Rebecca, cold and dismissive, with the switch in hand, haunted her. The longer she sat there, the more her frustration grew. She couldn't hold it in any longer. She needed to speak to him, to make him see what he had done, what he had become. But how? Frank wasn't a man who welcomed confrontation, especially from his daughter. The dinner plates were cleared by the staff, and as the table fell silent again, Amelie's heart raced. She knew this was her moment. "Father," she began, her voice steady but quiet, "we need to talk." Frank barely looked up from his glass of wine. "Is something troubling you, Amelie?" She hesitated for a second, searching for the right words. "Yes," she said finally, her gaze unwavering. "Something is troubling me. It's about Rebecca." At the mention of Rebecca's name, Frank's expression hardened slightly, though he still kept his eyes on the glass. He swirled the wine slowly, his movements deliberate. "What about her?" he asked, his tone sharp and businesslike, as if they were discussing an employee rather than a person who had been with them for over a decade. Amelie took a deep breath. "She told me what happened with the vase," she said, trying to keep her voice calm. "She told me that you—" Her voice caught in her throat for a moment, but she pushed forward. "That you hit her." Frank's hand paused mid-swirl, and he finally looked up at his daughter, his expression unreadable. For a long moment he said nothing, his eyes narrowing slightly as if calculating the best way to respond. "Is that what she told you?" he said, finally, his voice cool and controlled. Amelie's heart pounded in her chest. "It's true, isn't it?" Frank set the glass down with a soft clink, leaning back in his chair. His face was a mask of indifference, but there was a tension in his posture that hadn't been there before. "Rebecca broke an expensive vase," he said flatly. "I dealt with the situation accordingly." "You hit her," Amelie repeated, her voice growing stronger. "That's not dealing with the situation. That's cruelty." Frank's gaze darkened. "Amelie," he said, his voice low and steady, "I am running a household, a business. Rules must be followed. If there are no consequences for failure, then what stops the next mistake, or the one after that?" Amelie shook her head, disbelief flooding her chest. "That's not discipline, Father. That's abuse. Rebecca has been with us for years. She's always been loyal, always worked hard, and instead of understanding her situation, you hurt her." Frank's jaw clenched, a flicker of annoyance crossing his face. "You're too young to understand, Amelie. You haven't had to run a business, to manage people who depend on you for order. Without structure, without consequences, everything falls apart." "Is that really what you believe?" Amelie asked, her voice trembling slightly with emotion. "That hitting someone is the way to maintain order?" Frank stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "I don't need to justify myself to you," he said, his voice now laced with irritation. "Rebecca works for me, and I have the right to manage my household as I see fit." Amelie stood as well, her heart pounding with both fear and determination. She knew how difficult it was to stand up to her father, but she couldn't back down now. "Father, I'm not questioning your authority," she said, trying to keep her voice calm. "I'm questioning how you use it." Frank glared at her, his eyes flashing with anger. "I've built this life through discipline and hard work," he said through clenched teeth, "and I won't have you undermining everything I've taught you about how the world works." Amelie took a step closer, her gaze unwavering. "But what about everything you taught me about fairness, about respect?" she asked, her voice trembling with emotion. "You always told me that we should treat people with dignity, even when they make mistakes. What happened to that?" Frank was silent for a long moment, his expression hardening into a mask of control. Amelie could see the tension in his posture, the way his hands clenched at his sides. He wasn't used to being questioned, least of all by his daughter. For years, he had been the one in charge, the one who set the rules and enforced them without question. But now, for the first time, He was being forced to confront the consequences of his actions. "I do treat people with respect," Frank said finally, though there was a sharpness in his tone. "But respect has to be earned, Amelie. People have to understand that there are consequences for their actions. If I let one mistake slide, what message does that send to the rest of the staff?" Amelie shook her head, her heart aching at his words. "That's not respect, Father. That's fear. And fear doesn't inspire loyalty. It doesn't make people want to do better. It only makes them afraid of making mistakes." Frank's eyes flashed with frustration. "You think you know better than me?" he asked, his voice rising slightly. "You think you understand how to run a household, how to manage people, better than I do?" "No," Amelie said softly, her voice breaking slightly. "I don't think I know better than you. But I know that hitting someone, hurting someone, isn't the way to show them how to improve. It's not the way to lead." Her words hung in the air, heavy with the weight of truth. Frank stared at her for a long moment, his chest rising and falling with controlled breaths. Amélie could see the conflict in his eyes, the way he wrestled with his pride, his authority, and the daughter standing before him, questioning everything he believed. Finally, he turned away, walking toward the large bay window that overlooked the expansive grounds of their estate. His shoulders were tense, and for a moment he said nothing. Amélie stood there, waiting, her heart pounding in her chest. "You don't understand the pressure I'm under," Frank said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. "Running a business like mine, running this household, it's not easy. If I don't maintain control, everything falls apart, and I can't afford for things to fall apart, Amélie. Not now, not ever." Amélie took a deep breath, stepping closer to her father. "I understand that you have a lot of responsibility," she said gently. "I know how hard you've worked to build everything we have, but, Father, what good is all of this if it costs you the respect of the people who work for you? What good is it if it costs you your humanity?" Frank remained silent, his gaze fixed on the sprawling estate outside the window. His back was to her, but Amélie could see the tension in his posture, the way his hands clenched into fists at his sides. She wasn't sure if her words had reached him, but she knew she had to try. "You're not just the head of a business," Amélie continued, her voice soft but steady. "You're a father. You're someone who should inspire respect through fairness, not fear. And if you can't see that, then everything you've built will mean nothing." The room fell into a heavy silence once more. Amélie's heart ached as she waited, unsure of how her father would respond. But as the seconds stretched on, she began to feel the weight of her own words settle in her chest. She had spoken her truth, and now it was up to him to decide what to do with it. Finally, Frank turned around, his expression unreadable. His gaze met hers, and for the first time, Amélie saw something in his eyes that she hadn't seen before, a flicker of uncertainty. It was brief, but it was enough. "I'll think about what you've said," Frank said quietly, his voice strained. Amélie nodded, her heart lifting just slightly. It wasn't the full admission of guilt she had hoped for, but it was a start. And in that moment, she realized that change, however small, had begun to take root. The morning sun cast a soft glow over the estate as Amélie stood near the gate, a sense of purpose settling in her heart. After her confrontation with her father, she realized that words alone might not be enough to change him. If she wanted to help Rebecca and make her father see the truth, she needed to take action. And that action began with a visit to the person who had borne the brunt of his anger. Emily slipped out of the house without telling her father. She walked quickly along the familiar path that led from the estate to the small neighborhood on the edge of town where Rebecca lived. The street was far removed from the luxury of the Pager mansion. It was quiet, lined with modest houses that showed signs of wear, chipped paint, sagging fences, and narrow yards with overgrown grass. Amelie felt a lump form in her throat. Rebecca had been working for their family for years, yet her life seemed untouched by the comfort and wealth that surrounded the Pager estate. Rebecca's house was small but well kept, a testament to the quiet dignity with which she lived her life. Amelie hesitated at the gate, suddenly uncertain. She had always known Rebecca as their housekeeper, someone kind and diligent, but whose personal life she had never considered until now. It felt strange, almost intrusive, to see the world Rebecca returned to after long hours at the mansion. Taking a deep breath, Amelie pushed open the gate and made her way to the front door. She raised her hand to knock, her heart pounding in her chest. The door opened before she could bring her knuckles down, and there stood Rebecca. The older woman looked surprised to see her, but quickly masked it with a polite smile. There were dark circles under her eyes, and she moved carefully, as though every step caused her pain. But there was still warmth in her gaze, a softness that Amelie hadn't expected after what she had endured. "Miss Amelie," Rebecca said, her voice gentle, "what are you doing here?" Amelie offered a small, nervous smile. "I wanted to check on you. After everything, I needed to make sure you were all right." Rebecca's expression shifted slightly, as though she wasn't quite sure how to respond. "You didn't have to come all this way, child," she said, though her voice lacked the firmness of a true refusal. "I know," Amelie admitted, "but I had to. I couldn't just do nothing." Rebecca studied her for a moment longer, then stepped aside. "Come in." Amelie entered the small house, her eyes adjusting to the dim light. The living room was simple but tidy, with well-worn furniture and family photos lining the walls. The scent of lavender filled the air, giving the space a sense of warmth and comfort that felt worlds away from the cold grandeur of the mansion. "Please, sit," Rebecca said, gesturing to the couch. She moved slowly, easing herself into a nearby armchair with a wince she tried and failed to hide. "Are you in pain?" Amelie asked softly, concern etching her voice. Rebecca hesitated, then gave a small nod. "A little, but it'll pass." Amelie's heart ached at the sight of the woman who had always been so strong, now visibly weighed down by exhaustion and injury. "I'm so sorry, Rebecca, for what my father did. It wasn't right." Rebecca gave her a tired but kind smile. "You have nothing to apologize for, Miss Amelie. Your father, he has his ways." "But that doesn't make it okay," Amelie insisted. "You didn't deserve that. None of what happened was fair." Rebecca let out a soft sigh, folding her hands in her lap. "Life isn't always fair, child. I've learned that a long time ago." Amelie felt a swell of frustration rise in her chest. "But it should be. You've been with us for years, and you've worked so hard. You deserve to be treated with respect." Rebecca smiled gently, though there was sadness in her eyes. "I appreciate that, Amelie. But people like me, we don't get respect just because we work hard. We have to earn it, over and over again, no matter how long we've been around." Amelie bit her lip, fighting back the tears that threatened to spill over. "It's not fair," she whispered. "You deserve better." Rebecca reached out, placing a hand over Amelie's. "You have a good heart, child. Don't ever lose that. The world needs more people who care. Amelie squeezed Rebecca's hand, feeling a deep sense of connection with the woman she had always admired from a distance. "I just want to help," she said softly, "but I don't know how." Rebecca gave her hand a reassuring pat. "You're already helping, just by being here." They sat in comfortable silence for a few moments, the weight of unspoken understanding settling between them. Amelie looked around the modest living room, taking in the small details that made up Rebecca's life. There was a photo of a young girl, Rebecca's daughter, no doubt, smiling brightly from a hospital bed, her eyes filled with hope despite the oxygen tube running under her nose. Amelie's chest tightened at the sight. Rebecca's world was so different from her own, yet the woman before her carried herself with more strength and grace than anyone she had ever known. "How is your daughter?" Amelie asked gently, nodding toward the photo. Rebecca's face softened. "She's stable, for now. But it's always a struggle. The treatments, they take a lot out of her. And out of me, too." Amelie felt a pang of guilt. Rebecca had been dealing with so much, and no one, not her father, not the other staff, had bothered to see beyond the surface. They had taken her hard work for granted, never stopping to ask how she was doing, never offering to lighten her load. "I wish I could do more," Amelie whispered. Rebecca gave her a kind smile. "You're doing enough, child. Just knowing someone cares makes all the difference." Amelie nodded, though a part of her still felt helpless. She wanted to do more than just offer words of comfort. She wanted to make things right, and that meant confronting the man who had caused so much harm. "I promise," Amelie said quietly, her voice filled with resolve. "Things are going to change. I'll make sure of it." Rebecca gave her a knowing look, one that carried both hope and caution. "Be careful, Miss Amelie. Your father, he's not an easy man to change." "I know," Amelie admitted, "but I have to try." They sat together for a while longer, talking quietly about life, family, and the struggles they both faced in their own ways. And as Amelie listened to Rebecca's stories, she realized something important. Change didn't have to start with grand gestures or sweeping reforms. It could start here, in this small living room, with a conversation between two people who saw each other not as employer and employee, but as equals. When Amelie finally stood to leave, Rebecca walked her to the door, moving slowly but with quiet strength. "Thank you for coming, Miss Amelie," Rebecca said softly. "Thank you for letting me," Amelie replied with a small smile. As she stepped back out into the crisp morning air, Amelie felt a renewed sense of purpose. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, but she knew what she had to do. Change had to start somewhere, and it would start with her. She glanced back at the small house one last time before making her way home, her heart filled with both hope and determination. The next step would be the hardest, convincing her father to see what she now saw so clearly. But for Rebecca, for everyone who had been hurt by his actions, she was ready to try. The crisp morning air held a sharpness that mirrored the tension inside Frank Pager's chest. He had barely slept the previous night, his mind turning over Amelie's words again and again, unable to let them rest. She had spoken with such conviction, such sincerity, that it left a mark on him, a mark he couldn't easily erase. For the first time in a long while, Frank felt something unfamiliar creeping into his carefully structured world. Doubt. It wasn't that he believed he had been wrong. At least, that's what he kept telling himself. Running a business and a household of this size required discipline, and discipline required consequences. He had spent decades building a life of order, controlling every aspect of his world to ensure success. But what Amelie had said, that respect wasn't the same as fear, had lodged itself deep within him. He couldn't shake the feeling that perhaps his daughter had seen something in him that he had been too blind to acknowledge. Frank stood in front of his grand bedroom window, overlooking the sprawling estate. The early morning light bathed the garden in a soft glow, but he barely noticed the beauty of it. His thoughts were far away, drawn back to the image of Rebecca kneeling on the floor, her body hunched with exhaustion and pain, as if she were trying to become invisible. The memory gnawed at him. And then there was Amelie, her wide, determined eyes filled with a disappointment that stung more than he cared to admit. She had seen him lash out. She had seen him as something other than a father, something cruel. Frank knew he had to make this right, but how? Apologies didn't come easily to him. In fact, they hardly came at all. He had built his life on the belief that showing weakness, any weakness, would unravel everything he had worked for. But there was no denying the heaviness in his chest, the gnawing guilt that had settled there, refusing to be ignored. He needed to apologize to Rebecca. It was a thought that felt foreign, almost absurd, yet it was the only course of action that made sense now. Amelie had forced him to confront the truth, and he knew there was no going back. He couldn't continue pretending that nothing had changed, that his outburst was justifiable. He had crossed a line, and he knew it. The decision weighed heavily on him as he dressed for the day. Every movement felt slow, as though he were trudging through thick mud, trying to make sense of the emotions swirling inside him. By the time he left the house, Frank felt both determined and unsteady, as if he were stepping onto unfamiliar ground. His car pulled up in front of Rebecca's small house, and Frank felt a strange discomfort settle over him. He wasn't used to visiting the homes of his employees. Their lives outside of his estate were not his concern, or at least that's what he had always told himself, but now, standing before the modest home, Frank realized just how detached he had been. Rebecca had worked for his family for over a decade, yet this was the first time he had ever seen the place she called home. The house was neat and well kept, with a small garden out front that showed signs of careful tending. Frank took a deep breath and approached the front door, his hand hovering over the doorbell for a moment before pressing it. His heart pounded uncomfortably in his chest as he waited, the sound of his breath too loud in the morning stillness. The door opened slowly, and there stood Rebecca. For a moment, they both stared at each other, and Frank felt an odd sense of vulnerability creep up his spine. Rebecca looked surprised, her eyes widening slightly at the sight of him on her doorstep. It was clear she hadn't expected this, least of all from him. "Mr. Pager?" she said softly, her voice tinged with disbelief. Frank cleared his throat, suddenly unsure of what to say. Apologizing had seemed like the right thing to do, but now, standing in front of her, the words felt clumsy and inadequate. Still, he had come this far. "Rebecca," he began, his voice steady but quieter than usual. I've come to apologize." The words hung in the air between them, and Frank felt the weight of them more acutely than he had anticipated. He could see the surprise in Rebecca's eyes, as if she couldn't quite believe what she had just heard. "Apologize?" she repeated, her brow furrowing slightly. "Yes," Frank said, his tone more resolute now. "I've been thinking about what happened, what I did, and I realized that I crossed a line. It was wrong of me, and I'm sorry." Rebecca stood in stunned silence for a moment, as though processing the apology. Frank could see the emotions flicker across her face: surprise, uncertainty, and perhaps something else, something deeper. She had always been so strong, so steady, and yet, in this moment, she seemed to be searching for the right response. "You don't need to," she began, but Frank shook his head, cutting her off. "No, I do," he said firmly. "I treated you unfairly. I was angry, but that doesn't excuse what I did. You've worked for my family for years, and you've always been loyal and dependable. You deserved better than the way I treated you." Rebecca looked down at her hands, her fingers twisting together nervously. I appreciate your apology, Mr. Pager," she said softly. "It means more than you know." Frank felt a small sense of relief wash over him, though it was tempered by the knowledge that his apology couldn't undo what had been done. Still, it was a start, a necessary one. He glanced around the small, tidy living room and noticed the photos of Rebecca's daughter on the mantel. "How is your daughter?" Frank asked, his voice gentler now. He had never inquired about Rebecca's personal life before, but after what Amelie had told him, he realized just how little he truly knew about the people who worked for him. Rebecca's expression softened at the mention of her daughter, though there was a sadness in her eyes. "She's stable for now," she said quietly, "but it's a struggle. Every day is a struggle." Frank nodded, guilt tugging at his heart. He had never considered what Rebecca might be going through outside of work. He had always assumed that as long as the household ran smoothly, the lives of his employees were none of his concern. But now, standing in her home, he realized how narrow that view had been. "I didn't know," Frank admitted, his voice low. "About your daughter, I mean. I should have asked. I should have cared." Rebecca gave him a small, weary smile. "You have a lot on your plate, Mr. Pager. I never expected you to worry about my troubles." "But I should have," Frank insisted, the words tumbling out before he could stop them. "I've spent so much time focused on the business, on maintaining control, that I forgot to see the people around me. I forgot to see you." Rebecca's eyes glistened with unshed tears, and for a moment they stood in silence, the weight of everything unspoken settling between them. Finally, Rebecca spoke, her voice quiet but steady. "Thank you, Mr. Pager," she said, "for coming here, for apologizing. It's more than I ever expected." Frank nodded, feeling the tightness in his chest loosen just a little. "If there's anything I can do to help, anything at all, please let me know." Rebecca smiled softly, a genuine warmth in her expression. "I will. Thank you." As Frank turned to leave, he paused at the door, glancing back at the woman who had worked so tirelessly for his family. "I'll do better," he promised. "I'll make sure that things change, not just for you, but for everyone." Rebecca nodded, her eyes filled with quiet understanding. "I believe you will." As Frank stepped out into the morning light, a strange sense of peace settled over him. It wasn't a grand gesture, and it didn't erase the past, but it was a start. He had taken the first step toward change, and though he knew the road ahead would be difficult, he was ready to walk it. For the first time in years, Frank felt like he was finally seeing the world, really seeing it. And it was through the eyes of his daughter and the quiet strength of Rebecca that he had begun to understand what truly mattered. The days that followed Frank Pager's apology to Rebecca marked the beginning of a subtle but undeniable shift within the household. It wasn't just the apology that made a difference. It was the small but meaningful changes in Frank's behavior that rippled through the estate like a stone cast into a still pond. For years, the mansion had been a place of tension, where silence reigned and staff members moved cautiously, always on edge, afraid of a mistake that might cost them their jobs or dignity. But now, things were beginning to change. It started with small gestures, Frank acknowledging the staff with a nod or a brief word of thanks. These were things he had rarely done before, yet they made a world of difference. Rebecca returned to work with a lightness to her step that hadn't been there for a long time. She still worked just as diligently, but the fear that had once weighed her down was gone. There was a quiet confidence in her now, a sense of peace that came from knowing that, for the first time in years, her voice had been heard. Amelie noticed the changes immediately. She saw it in the way her father greeted Rebecca in the mornings, not with cold commands, but with simple, human acknowledgement. She saw it in the way the other staff members seemed more relaxed, their movements no longer stiff with fear. Even the air in the mansion felt different, lighter somehow, as if a cloud that had long hovered over the household had finally begun to lift. One afternoon, Amelie found herself in the kitchen, chopping vegetables alongside Rebecca. It had become something of a routine between them, a quiet time to connect, away from the formality of the dining room and the pressures of the outside world. "You know," Rebecca said with a small smile, "I wasn't sure what to expect after everything, but your father, he's trying. I can see that." Amelie smiled, warmth spreading through her chest. "He is, and I think it's because of you." Rebecca shook her head gently. "No, child, it's because of you. You made him see what he couldn't see before. That takes courage." Amelie blushed, her heart swelling with a mixture of pride and gratitude. "I just couldn't stay quiet," she admitted. "Not when I saw what he was doing. Not when I saw how it hurt you." Rebecca gave her a knowing look filled with warmth. "And that's what makes all the difference." The afternoon passed peacefully, with the sound of their quiet conversation filling the kitchen like a soft, comforting melody. For the first time in a long while, the mansion felt less like a place of rigid control and more like a home. That evening, as the sun set over the estate, Frank and Amelie sat together in the living room. It was a rare moment of quiet between them, the hum of the house settling into the background. Frank had been spending more time at home recently, making an effort to reconnect with his daughter. "I'm proud of you, you know," Amelie said softly, breaking the comfortable silence. Frank glanced at her, a flicker of surprise in his eyes. "Proud of me?" he repeated as though the words felt foreign coming from his daughter. Amelie nodded, her gaze steady. "For apologizing to Rebecca, for trying to be different. It means a lot to me." Frank leaned back in his chair, a thoughtful expression settling over his features. "I never thought it would be this difficult," he admitted. "Changing the way I think, the way I act. It's harder than I imagined." "But you're doing it," Amelie said with a small smile, "and that's what matters." Frank nodded slowly, his expression softening. "I suppose you're right." He glanced toward the window, where the last light of the day was fading into the horizon. For the first time in years, he felt a sense of peace, a sense that, perhaps, he was finally on the right path. It wasn't an easy path, but it was the right one, and that was what mattered most. In the weeks that followed, the changes in Frank's behavior began to ripple outward, touching everyone who worked in the mansion. He took the time to ask about their well-being, to listen when they spoke, and to acknowledge their hard work. These weren't grand gestures, but they were meaningful, and they created a shift in the way the staff saw him, not as a tyrant, but as someone who was trying to be better. Rebecca, in particular, noticed the change. She no longer felt invisible in the Pager household. There was a respect between her and Frank now, an unspoken understanding that hadn't existed before. It wasn't perfect, but it was real, and that was enough. One sunny afternoon, Rebecca found herself walking through the garden with Amelie, the two of them enjoying the peace of the moment. The flowers were in full bloom, their vibrant colors dancing in the sunlight, and the air was filled with the sweet scent of jasmine. "You've grown into quite the young woman, Amelie," Rebecca said with a smile. Amelie laughed softly. "I had a good teacher," she replied, giving Rebecca a meaningful look. Rebecca chuckled, her heart light. "And I had a little help from your father. He's learning, slowly but surely." Amelie smiled, feeling a deep sense of pride. Her father wasn't perfect, but he was trying, and that was all she had ever wanted. That evening, the three of them, Frank, Amelie, and Rebecca, sat together in the garden, the soft glow of lanterns illuminating the night. The air was warm, and the sounds of the city beyond the estate walls faded into the background, leaving only the peaceful hum of the garden. Frank leaned back in his chair, a contented smile on his face. "You know," he said thoughtfully, "I've spent so much time focusing on the business, on maintaining control, that I forgot what really matters." Amelie glanced at him, her heart swelling with warmth. "Family?" she asked softly. Frank nodded, his gaze resting on her. "Family," he repeated, "and the people who help us along the way." Rebecca smiled gently, her eyes shining with quiet gratitude. "It's never too late to learn, Mr. Pager." Frank returned her smile, a rare softness in his expression. "No, it's not," he agreed. They sat in comfortable silence, the night unfolding around them like a soft, warm blanket. It wasn't a perfect ending, but it was a beginning, a new beginning for all of them. And as the lanterns flickered gently in the breeze, Frank felt a sense of peace settle over him. He had spent years chasing success, believing that control was the only way to achieve it. But now he realized that true strength came from something much deeper: kindness, respect, and the willingness to change. For the first time in a long time, Frank felt truly at home. And in that moment, surrounded by his daughter and the woman who had taught him the meaning of humility, he knew that this was the life he wanted to build, a life not ruled by fear, but by love. Thank you for watching to the end. If you're hooked on this story, be sure to subscribe to our channel so as not to miss new releases. Click on the bell and get notifications first. Write in the comments what you think about this story and let us know where you are watching us from. In the meantime, move on to the next videos. There are even more intriguing stories waiting for you.